The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge, Tennessee, painting the small town in hues of gold and amber. Thomas Mitchell stood on his front porch, coffee mug trembling slightly in his weathered hands as he watched the American flag flutter in the gentle breeze. The red, white, and blue fabric seemed to dance with memories, some beautiful, others haunting. At 42, Thomas carried the invisible scars of 3 tours in Afghanistan. His brown hair, now streaked with premature gray, caught the sunlight as he adjusted his posture. A habit developed to compensate for the shrapnel still lodged near his spine. The doctors had said he was lucky to walk, but some days Thomas didn't feel particularly fortunate. "Morning, Tommy," called his neighbor, Margaret Sullivan, as she retrieved her newspaper from the driveway. Her voice carried the warmth that small-town folks reserved for those they'd known their entire lives. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," Thomas replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Margaret had been his third-grade teacher, and even now she maintained that gentle authority that made him feel simultaneously comforted and exposed. The sound of footsteps on gravel announced the arrival of Sarah Coleman, jogging past in her military-issued PT gear. She raised her hand in acknowledgement as she maintained her steady pace, her blonde ponytail swaying rhythmically. Sarah, 36, had returned from Iraq 8 months ago, and like Thomas, she was still navigating the complex terrain of civilian life. Thomas finished his coffee and headed inside, where photographs lined the mantelpiece. Images of his unit, his brothers in arms, frozen in time in desert camouflage. Some faces smiled back at him, others belonged to men who never made it home. He touched the frame containing a picture of himself with his best friend, Marcus Rodriguez, taken just days before Marcus stepped on an IED outside Kandahar. The phone rang, interrupting his reverie. "Mitchell Residence," he answered. "Thomas, it's Rebecca Harris from the town council," came the cheerful voice. Rebecca had been organizing Cedar Ridge's Independence Day celebration for the past 15 years, and her enthusiasm never seemed to wane. "I wanted to confirm you'll be at the Veterans Ceremony tomorrow. We've got something really special planned." "I'll be there, Rebecca. Same as every year." "This year's different, Thomas. We've got some surprise guests coming, and I think you and the other veterans are going to be amazed. I can't say much, but trust me on this one." After hanging up, Thomas felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Large gatherings still made him uncomfortable, but the annual ceremony was important. It was one of the few times Cedar Ridge's 37 veterans came together, sharing stories and finding solace in their collective experience. Across town, Sarah Coleman finished her morning run and headed to her job at Henderson's hardware store. The familiar scent of sawdust and metal filled her nostrils as she unlocked the front door. Working with her hands helped quiet the persistent noise in her head, the phantom sounds of helicopters and distant explosions that followed her from the desert. "Sarah, you're early again," observed Harold Henderson, the store's 70-year-old owner, as he emerged from the back office. Harold had served in Vietnam, and he understood the therapeutic value of routine and purpose. Hiring Sarah had been one of his better decisions, both for the store and for her. "Couldn't sleep," Sarah admitted, tying her work apron around her waist. "This Independence Day thing tomorrow has me thinking." Harold nodded knowingly. "First one since you've been back?" "Yeah. I keep thinking about my unit, wondering what they're doing, if they're okay." Sarah's voice carried a weight that Harold recognized from his own mirror. The morning brought a steady stream of customers preparing for the holiday celebration. Cedar Ridge's population of 8,000 swelled to nearly 15,000 during major events, as people from neighboring towns joined the festivities. The hardware store buzzed with activity as residents purchased American flags, grilling supplies, and last-minute items for their Independence Day preparations. Around noon, a convoy of black SUVs rolled down Main Street, causing a stir among the townspeople. Sarah watched through the store window as the vehicles parked near the town square, where workers had been setting up the stage for tomorrow's ceremony. "That's unusual," Harold commented, joining Sarah at the window. "Rebecca Harris is walking toward them like she knows what's going on." The afternoon brought more mystery as sound equipment trucks arrived, far more elaborate than the simple PA system typically used for the ceremony. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community that something significant was happening. But Rebecca Harris remained tight-lipped about the details. Thomas Mitchell arrived at the American Legion Hall for the weekly veterans meeting, held every Wednesday evening. The hall, a modest building donated by the Williamson family in 1952, served as a gathering place for Cedar Ridge's veterans across all generations. Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, each conflict was represented in the weathered faces that filled the folding chairs. "Gentlemen, and Sarah," announced James Patterson, the group's president and Vietnam veteran, as Sarah entered the room. "I'm sure you've all heard the rumors about tomorrow's ceremony. I spoke with Rebecca Harris this afternoon, and while she couldn't reveal everything, she assured me that we're in for something special." Robert Kim, a Korean War veteran in his 80s, raised his hand. "Special how? I've been to 60 of these ceremonies, and they're all the same. Flag presentation, speeches, and Mrs. Henderson's potato salad." Light laughter filled the room, but underneath the humor, Thomas detected a current of anxiety. Veterans, he'd learned, didn't always handle surprises well. "I think we should trust Rebecca," offered David Murphy, a Gulf War veteran who worked at the local bank. "She's never steered us wrong before, and she seemed genuinely excited about whatever she has planned." Sarah found herself studying the faces around her. Men and women who had served their country in different eras, facing different enemies, but sharing similar struggles with reintegration. Some, like Robert Kim and the other older veterans, had found their peace decades ago. Others, like herself and Thomas, were still fighting battles that couldn't be won with weapons or strategy. The meeting concluded with plans for their participation in tomorrow's ceremony. As veterans filed out into the warm evening air, Thomas found himself walking alongside Sarah. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice gentle but direct. Sarah appreciated his straightforward approach. "Some days better than others. The dreams are getting less frequent, but the noise in my head..." She trailed off, knowing he would understand. "It gets easier," Thomas assured her, though his own voice carried uncertainty. "Or maybe we just get better at managing it." They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the intersection where their paths diverged. The town square lay before them, now transformed with a substantial stage, professional lighting, and sound equipment that suggested tomorrow's event would be far grander than anyone had anticipated. "Whatever Rebecca has planned," Sarah said, "I hope it's worth all this build-up." "Me too," Thomas replied, though part of him wondered if he was ready for whatever surprise awaited them. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge, casting the town in twilight hues, neither veteran could have imagined that tomorrow's ceremony would change not only their lives, but the lives of veterans across the entire region. The stage was set, literally and figuratively, for something extraordinary. That night, Thomas lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind wandering between past and present. The familiar weight of memory pressed down on him: the sand, the heat, the constant vigilance, the friends who didn't make it home. But for the first time in months, another emotion competed with his usual melancholy: curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. Independence Day dawned crisp and clear in Cedar Ridge, with the kind of perfect blue sky that seemed designed for celebration. Thomas Mitchell woke before his alarm, his internal clock still attuned to military precision, despite being discharged 18 months ago. The town outside his window was already bustling with activity, as vendors set up booths along Main Street and families claimed prime spots for the evening's fireworks display. Sarah Coleman had been awake since 4:30, her sleep interrupted by dreams of convoy runs through Iraqi desert towns. She'd learned not to fight the early mornings, instead using the quiet hours for exercise and meditation techniques her VA counselor had taught her. By 7, she was dressed in her best civilian clothes, a simple blue dress that her sister had sent from Nashville, ready for whatever the day might bring. The town square had been completely transformed overnight. What had been a modest stage the previous evening was now a professional concert setup, complete with massive speakers, sophisticated lighting rigs, and video screens that could accommodate the growing crowd. Food trucks lined the perimeter, their aromatic offerings adding to the festive atmosphere. "My goodness!" exclaimed Eleanor Patterson, James Patterson's wife, as she surveyed the scene. "This looks like something you'd see at the Grand Ole Opry, not Little Cedar Ridge." Rebecca Harris moved through the crowd with the energy of a conductor orchestrating a symphony. Her clipboard never left her hand, as she coordinated with sound technicians, security personnel, and the growing number of volunteers helping with the event. The secret she'd been keeping for months was almost too exciting to contain. Thomas arrived at the designated assembly area behind the stage, where the 37 local veterans were gathering for their traditional pre-ceremony briefing. They represented 7 decades of American military service, from Robert Kim's Korean War service to Jennifer Walsh, who had returned from Afghanistan just 6 months earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," James Patterson called for attention, his voice carrying the authority of his former rank as Marine Sergeant. "I know you're all curious about the enhanced setup, and I'm pleased to announce that we have some very special guests joining us today." David Murphy raised his hand. "How special are we talking, James? The mayor of Nashville? A general?" James smiled mysteriously. "Let's just say that today, Cedar Ridge is going to be on the map in a way we never expected." Sarah noticed Thomas standing slightly apart from the group, his body language suggesting the hypervigilance that many combat veterans never fully abandoned. She made her way over to him, appreciating his steady presence among all the uncertainty. "You okay with all this?" she asked quietly. Thomas nodded slowly. "Still getting used to crowds, but I'm managing." "You?" "Same. Though I have to admit, I'm curious about what Rebecca has cooked up." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a tall man in his 50s, wearing jeans, boots, and a simple button-down shirt. There was something familiar about him, though Sarah couldn't immediately place where she'd seen his face. "Excuse me," the man said, approaching James Patterson. "I'm looking for the veterans group." "I'm Michael Brooks." James extended his hand in greeting. "James Patterson, Group President. Welcome to Cedar Ridge, Mr. Brooks. Are you with the surprise Rebecca mentioned?" Michael Brooks smiled warmly. "You could say that. I'm actually here with my friend Alan Jackson. We heard about your community and wanted to do something special for your Independence Day celebration." The impact of his words rippled through the group of veterans. Michael Brooks, not a name most recognized, but Alan Jackson was a different story entirely. The country music superstar had been honoring veterans through his music for decades. "Alan Jackson is here?" asked Jennifer Walsh, her voice reflecting the disbelief shared by everyone present. "He is indeed," Michael confirmed, along with my good friend Garth Brooks. "They've been planning this for months, working with Rebecca to make sure everything was perfect." Thomas felt a strange sensation in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in months. It might have been excitement, or perhaps just the unfamiliar feeling of anticipation for something positive. As if summoned by the mention of their names, 2 figures approached from behind the equipment trucks. Alan Jackson, unmistakable with his signature hat and gentle demeanor, walked alongside Garth Brooks, whose energy seemed to radiate even at a distance. The group of veterans fell silent, a mixture of awe and disbelief rendering them momentarily speechless. These weren't just country music stars. They were artists who had made veterans' causes central to their careers and personal missions. "Good morning, everyone," Garth Brooks said as he reached the group, his voice carrying genuine warmth. "I can't tell you how honored Alan and I are to be here with all of you today." Alan Jackson nodded in agreement. "We've heard about the Cedar Ridge Veterans community, about how you all look out for each other, and we wanted to be part of today's celebration." Robert Kim, the eldest veteran present, stepped forward with the bearing of a man who had faced down Chinese divisions at the Chosin Reservoir. "Mr. Brooks, Mr. Jackson, this is quite an honor. We never expected anything like this." "The honor is ours, sir," Garth replied, extending his hand to Robert. "You've served our country with distinction, and that deserves recognition." For the next 30 minutes, the two country music legends moved through the group of veterans, learning names, hearing abbreviated versions of service stories, and expressing genuine interest in each person's experience. Thomas found himself in conversation with Alan Jackson about the challenges of reintegration. "The music helps," Alan explained, "but I imagine it's different for everyone. What works for you?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Routine, mostly. Work? This group. Some days are better than others." "That's honest," Alan appreciated. "And honesty is important. We've got something planned for today that we hope will help, not just with today's celebration, but going forward." Before Thomas could ask what he meant, Rebecca Harris appeared with her ever-present clipboard and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Gentlemen, ladies, we need to get everyone into position. The ceremony begins in 20 minutes, and we've got a crowd of about 12,000 people out there." 12,000 people. Thomas felt his chest tighten slightly. Cedar Ridge's population was 8,000, which meant visitors had come from across the region for the event. The modest veterans ceremony he'd attended the previous year had suddenly become a major regional event. Sarah noticed his tension and moved closer. "We'll stick together," she said simply, understanding without explanation. The veterans were guided to a special seating area directly in front of the stage, marked with small American flags and signs reading, "Reserved for our heroes." The crowd that stretched across the town square and beyond was unlike anything Cedar Ridge had ever hosted. Families with children, elderly couples, teenagers with their phones ready to capture every moment, all united in anticipation. James Patterson took his place at the podium as the ceremony's traditional opening. His words, refined through years of practice, carried across the square with dignity and purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends and neighbors, welcome to Cedar Ridge's Independence Day Veterans Ceremony. Today, we gather not just to celebrate our nation's birthday, but to honor those who have served to protect the freedoms that birthday represents." The crowd settled into respectful attention as James continued. "This year's ceremony is particularly special, and I want to thank Rebecca Harris and her team for organizing what promises to be an unforgettable day." Alan Jackson and Garth Brooks stood in the wings, both men feeling the weight of the moment. They had performed for millions of people in venues around the world, but this felt different, more personal, more important. "You ready for this?" Alan asked his friend. Garth nodded, though his usual pre-performance energy was tempered by the solemnity of the occasion. "These people deserve something special. I just hope we can deliver." As James Patterson introduced the first part of the program, the traditional flag presentation by the local VFW Honor Guard, neither performer could have predicted that their surprise would evolve into something far more significant than a concert. The seeds of change were already planted. They just didn't know it yet. The ceremony continued with the Pledge of Allegiance, led by the youngest veteran present, Jennifer Walsh, and the Star-Spangled Banner, performed by the Cedar Ridge High School Choir. Each element built upon the previous one, creating an atmosphere of patriotic reverence that seemed to unite the massive crowd in shared purpose. Thomas found himself relaxing slightly as the familiar rhythms of the ceremony unfolded. These traditions, repeated across countless communities on Independence Day, provided a structure that felt safe and predictable. But he also sensed that something unprecedented was approaching, something that would challenge his carefully maintained equilibrium. Sarah watched the crowd, noting how the presence of families, children, and elderly veterans created a cross-section of American life that she hadn't experienced since returning from deployment. The diversity of ages and backgrounds reminded her why she had chosen to serve, even as she struggled with the ongoing costs of that service. The moment was approaching when everything would change, not just for the veterans of Cedar Ridge, but for their families, their community, and countless others who would be touched by what was about to unfold. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as Rebecca Harris stepped to the podium, her hands slightly trembling with the weight of the secret she was finally about to reveal. The crowd of 12,000 had grown restless with anticipation, and the veterans seated in the front section could feel the collective energy building like electricity in the summer air. "Friends, neighbors, and honored guests," Rebecca began, her voice carrying clearly across the town square through the professional sound system. "This year marks the 70th anniversary of Cedar Ridge's Independence Day Veterans Ceremony. 7 decades of honoring those who have served our great nation." Thomas Mitchell shifted in his seat, feeling Sarah Coleman's presence beside him as a source of stability in the growing anticipation. Around them, the other 35 veterans waited with varying degrees of curiosity and apprehension. Today, we have the extraordinary honor of welcoming 2 men who have made veterans' causes central to their life's work, Rebecca continued, her voice gaining strength. "Please join me in welcoming country music legends Alan Jackson and Garth Brooks." The crowd erupted as the 2 performers took the stage. Alan Jackson, in his signature black hat and simple shirt, waved to the audience with his characteristic humility. Garth Brooks, radiating energy even in stillness, raised both hands in acknowledgement of the thunderous applause that seemed to shake the very ground. "Thank you, Cedar Ridge," Garth called into the microphone as the applause gradually subsided. "Alan and I are honored to be here with all of you, but most especially with these incredible veterans who have served our country with distinction." Alan Jackson stepped to his microphone. "We've been to a lot of places and performed for a lot of crowds, but there's something special about being here today, in a community that truly understands what service means." Jennifer Walsh, the youngest veteran in the group, leaned over to David Murphy. "I can't believe they're actually here. This is incredible." But Robert Kim, with the wisdom of his 81 years, sensed something more significant brewing. "This feels like more than just a concert," he whispered to James Patterson. Garth Brooks addressed the crowd again. "Before we sing for you, Alan and I want to share something that's been in the works for several months. Rebecca Harris and your wonderful community have been part of a project that we believe will make a real difference in the lives of veterans, not just here in Cedar Ridge, but across the region." Thomas felt his heart rate increase. The phrase, "been in the works for several months," suggested something substantial, something planned and purposeful rather than spontaneous. Alan Jackson continued the explanation. "We've had the privilege of meeting veterans across this country, hearing their stories, understanding their challenges. Too often, the conversation focuses on what veterans need without asking what they want, or without involving them in creating solutions. The crowd listened intently as Alan's words carried across the square. Sarah found herself leaning forward, sensing that whatever was coming would be significant. 6 months ago, Garth Brooks said, we were introduced to your community through the work of Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a veterans advocate who grew up right here in Cedar Ridge before becoming a clinical psychologist specializing in post-trauma care. At the mention of Dr. Morrison's name, several local residents nodded in recognition. Elizabeth Morrison had been valedictorian of Cedar Ridge High School's class of 1995 before earning her doctorate and building a national reputation for her work with combat veterans. Dr. Morrison approached us with an idea, Alan Jackson continued, not for another charity or foundation, but for something more comprehensive, more sustainable, and more responsive to what veterans actually need. The veterans in the front section exchanged glances, trying to process what they were hearing. Harold Henderson, sitting with the other Korean War veterans, reached over and squeezed his wife Martha's hand. Garth Brooks gestured toward a large covered structure that had been erected behind the stage, concealed by red, white, and blue draping. What you're about to see represents months of planning, architectural design, and fundraising. But more importantly, it represents listening, really listening, to what veterans told us they needed. Rebecca Harris returned to the podium, her clipboard forgotten for the first time anyone could remember. Cedar Ridge, with the generous support of these two gentlemen and many others, will be home to the Heroes Haven Veterans Center, a comprehensive facility designed by veterans, for veterans, and their families. The draping began to fall away, revealing a detailed architectural model of a sprawling complex. Even from their seats, the veterans could see the careful thought that had gone into the design. Multiple buildings connected by covered walkways, extensive green spaces, and parking areas that suggested a facility designed to serve far more than Cedar Ridge's veteran population. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a sensation he couldn't immediately identify. It might have been hope, though he'd grown cautious about hope in recent months. Alan Jackson began explaining the specifics. The Heroes Haven Veterans Center will include a full-service mental health clinic staffed with professionals who specialize in post-trauma care. But it's more than that. It's job training facilities, temporary housing for veterans in transition, family counseling services, and recreational programs designed to build community. Sarah Coleman felt tears welling in her eyes. The scope of what was being described addressed every challenge she'd faced since returning from Iraq. The isolation, the difficulty finding meaningful work, the struggle to reconnect with civilian life. The center will serve a 3-county area, Garth Brooks added, with transportation services to ensure that rural veterans can access all programs. We estimate it will serve over 400 veterans and their families directly, with broader community programming that will benefit thousands more. David Murphy raised his hand, his banker's instincts kicking in despite the emotional weight of the moment. This sounds incredible, but the cost must be enormous. How is this being funded? Garth Brooks smiled. That's where the real beauty of this project comes in. Rather than relying solely on government funding or traditional charitable donations, Heroes Haven is being established as a self-sustaining enterprise. The facility will include a conference center, recreational vehicle park, and event spaces that will generate ongoing revenue to support all veteran services. Alan Jackson continued the explanation. Veterans will be employed in every aspect of the center's operation, from administration to maintenance, from counseling to food service. It's not just about providing services, it's about creating opportunities for meaningful work and leadership roles. James Patterson stood up slowly, his voice carrying the weight of his 68 years and his decades of advocating for fellow veterans. Mr. Brooks, Mr. Jackson, I don't have words. When will construction begin? Groundbreaking is scheduled for August 1st, Rebecca Harris announced, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. The first phase, including the mental health clinic and job training center, should be operational within 18 months. The crowd erupted again, but this time the applause carried a different quality. Not just appreciation for entertainment, but recognition of something transformative happening in their community. Robert Kim struggled to his feet, his 81-year-old frame still carrying the bearing of the Marine he'd been 70 years earlier. In all my years, through all the wars, I've never seen anything like this. Not just the facility, but the way it's been planned, with veterans at the center of every decision. That was intentional, sir. Garth Brooks replied with evident respect. Dr. Morrison insisted that this couldn't be something done for veterans, but something done with veterans. Every design decision, every program element, every staffing plan has been reviewed and refined based on input from veterans themselves. Thomas found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. What about those of us who are still struggling? Will there be programs for people who aren't sure they're ready for job training or group settings? Alan Jackson nodded thoughtfully. The center is being designed with multiple entry points. Some people might start with one-on-one counseling, others with recreational programs, still others with volunteer opportunities. There's no predetermined path, just resources available when you're ready to use them. Sarah Coleman stood up, her blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight. I have a question about the family services. Many of us have relationships that were damaged by deployment, by the challenges of reintegration. How do you rebuild trust with people who love you but can't understand what you've been through? The question hung in the air with the weight of personal experience. Alan Jackson and Garth Brooks exchanged glances before Alan responded. That's one of the most important aspects of Heroes Haven. Family counseling isn't an afterthought. It's central to the mission. Dr. Morrison's research shows that veteran reintegration is most successful when families are full partners in the process, not just supporters from the sidelines. Margaret Sullivan, Thomas's former third-grade teacher, called out from the crowd. What can the rest of us do? How can the community support this center? Garth Brooks's response surprised many with its depth. The most important thing the community can do is what Cedar Ridge is already doing, treating veterans as neighbors and friends, not as broken people who need fixing. Heroes Haven will provide professional services, but healing happens in relationship, in community, in being known and valued for who you are now, not just for what you did in uniform. Eleanor Patterson wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to her husband James struggle with his own emotions. In 30 years of marriage to a veteran, she'd watched him carry burdens he couldn't fully share, and the promise of professional support designed specifically for families felt like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to voice. The ceremony continued with both performers offering several songs, but the music now carried additional weight. When Garth Brooks sang The Dance, the lyrics about life's choices and their consequences resonated differently with the veteran audience. Alan Jackson's Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning became not just a song about national tragedy, but about the ongoing service of those who responded to that tragedy with their own sacrifices. As the formal program concluded, both performers remained on stage for questions from veterans and community members. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of planning that had gone into Heroes Haven, but also the genuine commitment of everyone involved to creating something truly responsive to veteran needs. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who had been seated in the VIP section, joined the discussion to explain her role in the project's development. Her return to Cedar Ridge after building a national career felt symbolic. Successful people investing in their communities, using their expertise to benefit the places that shaped them. The research is clear. Dr. Morrison explained to the crowd. Veterans do best when they have access to specialized care, meaningful work, strong community connections, and family support. Heroes Haven is designed to address all of these areas in an integrated way. Thomas Mitchell found himself in conversation with several other veterans as the official program ended. For the first time in months, the future held possibilities beyond simply managing his symptoms and getting through each day. The prospect of meaningful work, of using his military experience in civilian roles, of being part of something larger than his individual struggle, created a sense of anticipation he'd forgotten was possible. Sarah Coleman sought out Dr. Morrison during the informal gathering that followed the ceremony. Their conversation about family relationships and reintegration challenges lasted nearly an hour, providing Sarah with resources and perspectives that her VA counselor hadn't been able to offer. As the afternoon wore on and families began preparing for the evening fireworks display, the veterans of Cedar Ridge found themselves clustered in small groups, processing what they'd experienced. The promise of Heroes Haven wasn't just about future services. It was about being seen, valued, and included in solutions rather than simply identified as problems to be solved. The revelation had exceeded everyone's expectations, but it also raised questions about what would come next. How do you move from the excitement of announcement to the practical work of construction, programming, and implementation? How do you maintain momentum over the 18 months of construction? How do you ensure that the reality lives up to the promise? These questions would be answered in the months ahead. But for now, Cedar Ridge basked in the glow of possibility and the knowledge that their community had been chosen for something extraordinary. The sun was setting on Independence Day, but it felt like dawn for the veterans who called Cedar Ridge home. 3 months had passed since the July 4th ceremony, and Cedar Ridge hummed with activity unlike anything the town had experienced in its 150-year history. Construction vehicles lined Highway 41 as crews prepared the 40-acre site donated by the Williamson family for the Heroes Haven Veterans Center. Thomas Mitchell stood at the edge of the construction zone, wearing a hard hat and safety vest that still felt foreign after his months of civilian work clothes. "Hard to believe it's really happening," said Sarah Coleman, joining him at the temporary fence that surrounded the construction site. She'd been hired as the project's Veteran Liaison Coordinator, a position created specifically to ensure that veteran voices remained central throughout the building process. Thomas nodded, adjusting his grip on the architectural plans he'd been reviewing. His new role as construction supervisor had surprised everyone, including himself. When the general contractor, Davidson Construction from Nashville, learned about his military engineering background and local knowledge, they'd offered him the position without hesitation. "Foundation for Building A is scheduled to be poured next week," Thomas reported, his voice carrying a confidence that had been absent for months. "The mental health clinic should have walls by Thanksgiving." Dr. Elizabeth Morrison approached from the construction trailer that served as the project headquarters. Her weekly visits to Cedar Ridge had become a community event, with local residents treating her return as a homecoming celebration. Today, however, she carried the focused energy of someone dealing with complex logistics. "Thomas, Sarah, I need to discuss the staffing timeline with you both," she said, her expression serious but optimistic. "We've had an incredible response to the job postings. Over 200 applications for positions that won't even exist for another year." Sarah pulled out her tablet, where she'd been tracking all veteran inquiries about the center. "I've got 43 local veterans interested in various positions, plus another 78 from the 3-county area. The response has been overwhelming." The three of them walked toward the project trailer, passing the massive sign erected by Davidson Construction. "Future Home of Heroes Haven Veterans Center, opening fall 2026. Below the main text, a smaller sign credited the major donors. Made possible through the generosity of Garth Brooks, Alan Jackson, and the Heroes Haven Foundation. Inside the trailer, architectural drawings covered every available wall space. The original design had been expanded twice based on veteran feedback sessions held throughout the summer. What had begun as a modest facility now encompassed 8 buildings connected by covered walkways, designed to serve up to 600 veterans and their families annually. The challenge, Dr. Morrison explained, spreading out the latest staffing charts, is matching the right people with the right positions, while ensuring we maintain the veteran-centric culture that makes this project special. James Patterson entered the trailer, followed by Rebecca Harris. Both had become unofficial community liaisons for the project, helping coordinate between the construction team, the developers, and Cedar Ridge residents. James's military bearing and Rebecca's organizational skills had made them indispensable. "Morning, everyone," James said, setting down a box of fresh donuts from Sullivan's Bakery. "Rebecca and I have been reviewing the community impact assessments, and the numbers are remarkable." Rebecca opened her ever-present notebook. Local hotel bookings are up 30% for the next 18 months, with people wanting to see the construction progress. 3 new restaurants have opened on Main Street, and Henderson's hardware store has hired 4 additional employees to handle increased business. Harold Henderson, who had been quietly supportive throughout the process, had found his store becoming an unofficial information center for project updates. Veterans from across the region stopped by to ask questions, purchase supplies for their own projects, and simply talk with someone who understood their experience. "The economic impact is significant," Dr. Morrison acknowledged, "but I'm more interested in the social changes." "Sarah, what are you hearing from the veteran community?" Sarah consulted her notes from the previous week's informal veteran gatherings. The weekly coffee meetings at the American Legion Hall have grown from 15 regular attendees to over 40. Veterans are driving from 3 counties to participate. And it's not just about Heroes Haven anymore. People are organizing carpools to VA appointments, sharing job leads, starting recreational groups. Thomas added his observations from the construction site. "I'm seeing the same thing among the workers." Davidson Construction hired 12 veterans for various positions on this project, and they're forming friendships that extend beyond work hours. Last weekend, 6 of them worked together to repair Robert Kim's roof after that storm damage. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Michael Brooks, Garth Brooks's business manager, who had become a regular presence in Cedar Ridge. His monthly visits weren't just about project oversight. He'd developed genuine relationships within the community and often brought his family along for weekend visits. "Good morning, everyone," Michael said, carrying coffee from the new cafe that had opened specifically to serve construction workers and project visitors. "I've got updates from Nashville, and Garth wanted me to relay some important information about the next phase of development." He opened his laptop and connected it to the trailer's presentation screen. The Heroes Haven Foundation has exceeded all fundraising expectations. Between concert proceeds, private donations, and corporate sponsorships, we're looking at being fully funded through the first 5 years of operation. The implications of full funding meant more than financial security. It represented the ability to attract top-tier professionals, implement innovative programs, and maintain services without the constant pressure of fundraising that plagued many veteran-focused organizations. "There's more," Michael continued, advancing to the next slide. "Alan Jackson and Garth Brooks want to establish an endowment fund that will ensure Heroes Haven remains financially sustainable indefinitely. They're planning a series of benefit concerts across the Southeast, with all proceeds dedicated to the endowment." Rebecca Harris nearly dropped her pen. "How much money are we talking about?" "The goal is a $50 million endowment. Michael replied matter-of-factly. At current investment returns, that would generate enough annual income to cover operating expenses in perpetuity, ensuring that Heroes Haven never has to turn away a veteran due to financial constraints. The trailer fell silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what was being described. Thomas found himself gripping the edge of the table, overwhelmed by the realization that this project was far more substantial than anyone had initially imagined. Dr. Morrison was the first to speak. "Michael, this changes everything. With that level of financial security, we can implement programs that other facilities can't afford to maintain long-term. We can afford to take risks, to innovate, to really push the boundaries of what veteran services can look like." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Not anxiety this time, but something closer to awe. What does this mean for the veterans who are already planning to be part of the staff? Will there be additional positions available? Absolutely, Michael confirmed. The expanded funding means we can hire additional veterans in every department, from administration to maintenance to programming. More importantly, it means we can offer competitive salaries and comprehensive benefits packages. James Patterson, who had remained quiet during the financial discussion, finally spoke. "In my 45 years since Vietnam, I've seen a lot of promises made to veterans. Some kept, many broken. What makes this different?" Michael understood the skepticism behind the question. "James, the difference is structure and commitment. This isn't dependent on annual budget appropriations or changing political priorities. The endowment will be managed by an independent board with fiduciary responsibility to maintain services. Veterans will have voting representation on that board." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the trailer door. David Murphy entered, followed by Jennifer Walsh and 3 other local veterans who had been observing the construction progress from the public viewing area established along the highway. "Sorry to interrupt," David said, "but we've been getting questions from veterans across the region about how to apply for services once the center opens. Is there a waiting list? Application process? We need some guidance." Dr. Morrison welcomed the question. "That's exactly the kind of input we need. Sarah, this might be a good time to discuss the intake and assessment protocols we've been developing." Sarah opened another file on her tablet. "We're designing a system that eliminates traditional barriers to access. No lengthy paperwork, no months-long waiting lists, no requirements to prove your level of need. Veterans can simply walk in and speak with an intake coordinator, another veteran, who will help identify appropriate services." Jennifer Walsh, who had struggled with VA bureaucracy since her return from Afghanistan, looked skeptical. "That sounds too good to be true. How do you manage resources if anyone can access any service at any time?" Dr. Morrison fielded this question. "The key is flexibility and scalability. Rather than rigid program structures, we're creating modular services that can be combined based on individual needs. Some veterans might need intensive mental health support. Others might benefit more from vocational training or social connections." Thomas found himself thinking about his own journey since returning from Afghanistan. What about veterans who aren't ready for formal programs? "I spent months just trying to figure out how to sleep through the night before I could even think about job training or counseling." That's exactly why we're including low-commitment entry points, Dr. Morrison explained. "Coffee hours, recreational activities, volunteer opportunities. Ways for veterans to experience the community before committing to formal services. The goal is to meet people wherever they are in their journey." Michael Brooks added another layer to the discussion. "One of the unique aspects of Heroes Haven is the emphasis on peer support. Veterans helping other veterans isn't just philosophically appealing. Research shows it's more effective than traditional provider-client models for many issues." Rebecca Harris, ever practical, raised logistical concerns. With this expanded scope, what about housing for veterans who need to travel here for services? Cedar Ridge has limited hotel capacity. That's been addressed in the building plans, Thomas replied, pointing to the architectural drawings. Building C includes 32 efficiency apartments for short-term stays, plus a larger dormitory-style facility for group programs. Veterans can stay on-site for up to 90 days while accessing intensive services. The discussion continued for another hour, covering everything from transportation services for rural veterans to partnerships with local colleges for educational programs. Each answer seemed to generate new questions, but the overall tone remained optimistic and solution-focused. As the meeting concluded, the group walked outside to observe the construction progress. The foundation for Building A had been poured the previous week, and steel framework was beginning to rise from the concrete base. Construction workers moved with purpose across the site, many of them veterans hired specifically for the project. "It's starting to look real," Jennifer Walsh observed, watching a crane position a massive steel beam. "It was always real," Sarah replied. "We just didn't believe it yet." Thomas walked the perimeter of the construction site, mentally comparing the emerging structures with the architectural plans he'd been studying for months. The precision of the construction crew, led by foreman Robert Martinez, a Navy veteran who had worked on military installations worldwide, gave him confidence that the finished facility would meet the high standards set by the design team. As evening approached, the veterans began to disperse to their respective homes and commitments. But the conversations continued in the parking lot, at Sullivan's Diner, and in the living rooms where families gathered to discuss the day's developments. Harold Henderson closed his hardware store and drove to the construction site for his daily evening walk around the perimeter. At 70, he'd found unexpected energy in being part of something that would outlast his own lifetime. The store was busier than it had been in decades, but more importantly, he was surrounded by purpose and community in ways he hadn't experienced since his own return from Vietnam. Eleanor Patterson prepared dinner while listening to her husband James on the phone with veterans across the region, sharing information about Heroes Haven and encouraging them to visit Cedar Ridge during the construction phase. The weekly veterans meetings had evolved into community-wide events, with family members and local residents regularly attending to stay informed about the project's progress. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison returned to her hotel room. She'd been staying at the newly opened Cedar Ridge Inn rather than commuting from Nashville, and spent the evening reviewing research data from other veteran service facilities. Heroes Haven was being designed to be more comprehensive and innovative than existing models, which meant there were fewer precedents to guide decision-making. Her phone rang as she was reviewing staffing models for the mental health clinic. The caller ID showed Alan Jackson's number. "Elizabeth, it's Alan. I wanted to check in on how things are progressing in Cedar Ridge." "Alan, the progress is remarkable. The community has embraced this project in ways that exceed our most optimistic projections. But I'm also seeing challenges we hadn't fully anticipated." "What kind of challenges?" Dr. Morrison paused, choosing her words carefully. "Success challenges. The demand for services is already higher than our projections, even before we open. Veterans are relocating to the area specifically to be near Heroes Haven. We might need to think about expansion sooner than planned." Alan Jackson was quiet for a moment. "That's a good problem to have, but it's still a problem. What do you need from us?" "Time to think through the implications, and possibly a planning session with you, Garth, and the Foundation Board to discuss accelerated timelines. Consider it done. We'll arrange something for next month." "Elizabeth, what's your honest assessment of how this is affecting the local community?" Dr. Morrison looked out her hotel window at Main Street, where 3 restaurants remained open past their usual closing times to serve construction workers and project visitors. It's transforming the entire town, Alan. And I think that transformation is positive, but it's happening faster than anyone expected. After ending the call, Dr. Morrison returned to her research, but her mind kept wandering to the conversations she'd had throughout the day. The enthusiasm and commitment she'd witnessed in Cedar Ridge was extraordinary, but it also carried responsibilities. Success would bring its own challenges, and maintaining the veteran-centered culture that made Heroes Haven special would require constant vigilance. Meanwhile, Thomas Mitchell sat on his front porch, watching the lights from the construction site illuminate the horizon. For the first time since his return from Afghanistan, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow, to next week, to next year. The weight of purpose had replaced the weight of aimlessness, and the difference was transformative. Sarah Coleman finished her evening run and paused at the construction site fence. The skeletal framework of Building A was barely visible in the darkness, but she could envision the completed facility. Veterans working alongside each other, families healing together, community being rebuilt one conversation at a time. The project was 4 months from groundbreaking, 14 months from opening, but it was already changing lives. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new reasons to hope that the future could be different from the past. 18 months later, on a crisp October morning, Thomas Mitchell stood in the main lobby of Heroes Haven Veterans Center, adjusting his tie for the 10th time in 5 minutes. As the facility's director of operations, he'd overseen every aspect of the construction and implementation process. But today, opening day, felt surreal. The lobby around him bustled with activity as final preparations were made for the grand opening ceremony. Sarah Coleman, now the center's program coordinator, moved efficiently between registration tables, ensuring that every detail was perfect for the 200 veterans and their families expected to attend. "Thomas, you need to stop fidgeting," Sarah called over with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time since he'd known her. "This place is amazing, and you helped build it." Literally, the transformation was indeed remarkable. What had been an empty field 18 months earlier was now a state-of-the-art facility spanning 8 buildings connected by covered walkways and surrounded by carefully landscaped grounds. The architecture blended modern functionality with traditional Southern design elements, creating a space that felt both professional and welcoming. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison emerged from her office in Building A, the mental health clinic that had been the first structure completed. She'd moved permanently to Cedar Ridge 6 months earlier, establishing her practice within Heroes Haven, while maintaining consulting relationships with veteran facilities nationwide. "The media trucks are starting to arrive," she announced to Thomas and Sarah. CNN, Nashville Public Television, and several regional news outlets, plus representatives from veteran organizations across the Southeast. The attention was expected but still overwhelming. Heroes Haven had become a model for innovative veteran services, attracting visitors and inquiries from across the country. The Department of Veterans Affairs had sent a delegation to study the center's integrated approach to veteran care. Rebecca Harris rushed past carrying her clipboard. Though her role had evolved from volunteer organizer to Heroes Haven's community liaison director. "Garth and Alan's buses just turned onto Highway 41, she announced. ETA 5 minutes. Through the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows, Thomas could see veterans and their families gathering in the outdoor amphitheater where the opening ceremony would take place. Many faces were familiar from the weekly veterans meetings that had continued throughout the construction process, but others belonged to veterans from across the 3-county service area who were experiencing Heroes Haven for the first time. Robert Kim, now 83, sat in the front row of the amphitheater, wearing his marine dress blues with the same pride he'd carried for 6 decades. Beside him, Jennifer Walsh conversed with a group of younger veterans, several of whom had already been hired for positions at the center. James Patterson approached Thomas with the bearing of a man carrying important news. "Thomas, I just got word from the foundation board. The endowment has reached $62 million, 8 months ahead of schedule. Heroes Haven is now financially secure for the foreseeable future." The implications were staggering. Full funding meant the center could focus entirely on serving veterans rather than worrying about financial sustainability. It also meant that other communities were already requesting assistance in establishing similar facilities. "There's more," James continued. "Alan and Garth want to discuss expanding the Heroes Haven model to other states. They're talking about a network of facilities, all following the principles we've established here." Before Thomas could respond, the distinctive rumble of tour buses announced the arrival of the day's guests of honor. Through the windows, he watched as Garth Brooks and Alan Jackson stepped off their respective buses, immediately surrounded by the small crowd of local residents who had gathered despite the early hour. Sarah joined Thomas at the window. "You know what strikes me most about this whole thing?" "What's that?" 18 months ago, we were both struggling just to get through each day. Now look at us, running a facility that's going to help hundreds of other veterans find their way forward." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of transformation in his own life. The nightmares hadn't disappeared entirely, but they came less frequently. More importantly, he'd found purpose that extended beyond his own healing. Leading heroes. Haven's operations gave him a reason to get up each morning that went far beyond personal survival. Dr. Morrison joined them at the window. "5 minutes until we start. Are you both ready for this?" "Ready as we'll ever be," Sarah replied, "though I still can't quite believe it's real." The opening ceremony began with James Patterson introducing the Heroes Haven staff. 12 full-time employees, 8 of whom were veterans. The diversity of backgrounds was remarkable. Combat veterans from Vietnam through Afghanistan, family members who had experienced the challenges of reintegration, and civilian professionals who specialized in veteran services. Alan Jackson took the podium first, his voice carrying clearly across the amphitheater. 18 months ago, Garth and I came to Cedar Ridge thinking we were going to perform a concert. We had no idea we were going to become part of something that would change our own lives as much as we hoped it would change yours. The crowd listened intently as Alan continued. Heroes Haven represents something new in veteran services. Not charity, but partnership. Not temporary assistance, but sustainable support. Not treating veterans as problems to be solved, but as leaders in creating solutions. Garth Brooks followed with remarks that focused on the broader implications of the Heroes Haven model. What we've built here in Cedar Ridge is proof that communities can come together to solve complex problems. This center serves veterans, but it's also revitalized an entire town and created a model that other communities can adapt to their own needs. Thomas was called to the podium to provide an overview of the center's services and programs. Standing before the crowd, he felt a moment of vertigo. Not anxiety, but amazement at how far he'd traveled from the broken veteran who had struggled to leave his house 18 months earlier. Heroes Haven offers comprehensive services because veterans' needs are comprehensive, he began, his voice steady and confident. Mental health counseling, job training, temporary housing, family support, recreational programs, and peer counseling, all designed to work together rather than as separate, disconnected services. He gestured toward the various buildings that comprise the complex. But the real innovation here isn't the services themselves. It's the culture. Veterans helping other veterans. Families supporting other families. A community that sees military service as an asset rather than a liability. Sarah followed with a presentation about the center's programming philosophy. We don't have requirements or prerequisites for services. Veterans can start wherever they feel comfortable. Joining a hiking group, attending a family barbecue, volunteering with maintenance projects, or diving straight into intensive counseling. The only requirement is showing up. The formal presentations concluded with Dr. Morrison discussing the research component of Heroes Haven's work. Everything we do here is being documented and evaluated so that other communities can learn from our successes and failures. Veterans who receive services here are also contributing to knowledge that will benefit veterans everywhere. Following the ceremony, attendees were invited for tours of the facility. The response was overwhelming. Veterans examining the job training equipment, families exploring the child care facilities, and community members marveling at the scope of services available. Harold Henderson, now retired and volunteering as Heroes Haven's maintenance coordinator, led a group through Building F, which housed the vocational training programs. These machine shops and computer labs are equivalent to what you'd find at a major technical college, he explained with evident pride. Veterans can earn certifications in everything from welding to information technology. Eleanor Patterson guided families through Building D, which contained meeting spaces for support groups, family counseling offices, and a large multi-purpose room designed for community events. The goal is to strengthen families, not just help individual veterans, she explained. Military service affects entire families, so recovery has to involve entire families. Margaret Sullivan, Thomas's former third-grade teacher, had become an unofficial historian for the Heroes Haven project. She led visitors through the displays that documented the center's development, from the initial July 4th announcement through the construction process to opening day. The remarkable thing, Margaret told each group, is how this project brought out the best in everyone involved. Veterans found purpose, community members found ways to serve, and business owners found opportunities to contribute. It wasn't just about building a facility, it was about building relationships. As the afternoon progressed, spontaneous conversations developed throughout the complex. Veterans shared stories, families exchanged contact information, and community members volunteered for various support roles. The formal opening ceremony had evolved into an organic community celebration. David Murphy, who had taken a leave of absence from the bank to serve as Heroes Haven's financial administrator, found himself in conversation with veterans interested in the center's business training programs. We're not just helping veterans find jobs, he explained. We're helping them start businesses, develop leadership skills, and become economic contributors to their communities. Jennifer Walsh worked with a group of female veterans who were experiencing the challenges of military to civilian transition while also managing family responsibilities. The support here isn't just professional, she told them. It's personal. We understand what you're going through because we've been there ourselves. As evening approached, Garth Brooks and Alan Jackson prepared for their departure, but not before spending additional time with individual veterans and their families. The conversations were personal and unrushed, reflecting the genuine relationships that had developed over the 18 months of planning and construction. Thomas, Garth said during their final conversation of the day, "You've exceeded every expectation we had for this project. More importantly, you've created something that will serve veterans long after all of us are gone." Alan Jackson nodded in agreement. The success of Heroes Haven isn't measured in buildings or budgets. It's measured in lives changed, families healed, and communities strengthened. On all those measures, this has been an extraordinary success. As the buses departed and the crowds dispersed, the Heroes Haven staff gathered in the main lobby for a brief debriefing session. The day had been long and intense, but the energy level remained high. "So," Dr. Morrison asked the group, "how did it feel to finally open our doors?" Sarah spoke first. "Overwhelming, in the best possible way. I saw veterans today who drove 3 hours just to see what we've built. The need is even greater than we anticipated. Thomas added his observations. The facility exceeded everyone's expectations. But what impressed me most was watching veterans immediately start helping other veterans. The peer support culture we wanted to create was happening naturally. Rebecca Harris consulted her notes from the day's conversations. I collected contact information from 43 veterans interested in services, 17 community members wanting to volunteer, and 6 other communities asking about replicating the Heroes Haven model. James Patterson raised a practical concern. With this level of interest, we need to think about managing capacity. We don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. Dr. Morrison had been considering the same issue. That's where the network concept becomes important. Rather than trying to serve everyone from this single location, we help other communities develop their own Heroes Haven facilities. The conversation continued as staff members processed the magnitude of what they'd accomplished and began planning for the challenges ahead. Heroes Haven was no longer a dream or a construction project. It was an operational facility with real responsibilities to real people. As the group finally dispersed to their homes, Thomas remained in the lobby, walking slowly through the space he'd helped design and build. The walls displayed photographs from the construction process, testimonials from veterans who had been involved in the planning, and architectural drawings showing the center's evolution from concept to reality. Sarah joined him for this final walkthrough. You know what I realized today? What's that? We didn't just build a veterans center. We proved that broken things can be fixed, that communities can solve complex problems, and that hope is a practical tool for creating change. Thomas looked out the lobby windows at the Cedar Ridge skyline, transformed by the presence of Heroes Haven, but still recognizably the small town where he'd grown up. The question now is whether we can maintain what we've created. Success brings its own challenges. We'll figure it out, Sarah replied with the confidence of someone who had already overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. We've got good people, adequate resources, and a clear mission. Most importantly, we've got each other. As they turned off the lights and locked the doors of Heroes Haven Veterans Center, Thomas Mitchell and Sarah Coleman carried with them the satisfaction of work well done and the anticipation of work yet to be accomplished. Tomorrow would bring the first regular day of operations, the beginning of the center's real purpose. Behind them, the facility stood illuminated against the Tennessee night sky, a beacon of hope for veterans across the region and a testament to what could be accomplished when communities came together with purpose, resources, and commitment to serving those who had served them. The story that had begun with a July 4th surprise had evolved into something far more significant than anyone had imagined. Heroes Haven Veterans Center was operational, but more importantly, it had created a model for veteran services that other communities were already beginning to adopt. The sound of gratitude had become the sound of transformation, echoing across Cedar Ridge and beyond to wherever veterans and their families needed to know that their service mattered. Their struggles were understood, and their futures held promise for healing, purpose, and community. In the months and years that would follow, Heroes Haven would serve thousands of veterans and their families, establish satellite centers in 4 other states, and influence national policy on veteran services. But on this night, it was simply a building filled with hope and the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. The legacy was no longer just promised, it was realized, operational, and ready to change lives one veteran, one family, one community at a time.